our two musicians were, one's originally from Jordan, the other is originally from Armenia, now here in Abu Dhabi, but performing for the world, not least those joining us online, which is a nice cue for the next participant in our creative conversations, the multi-talented Sumayya Vally, who was born and established an architectural practice in Johannesburg. Fortunately for us, in the UK, we need some help at the moment. She's established a practice in London too, so works between the two cities, and is also going to be the inaugural curator, part of a curatorial team, of the first you took part in the Istanbul Biennale, of the first Islamic Biennale in Jeddah early next year. Sumayya, I asked your compatriot, Trevor Noah, how he described himself 2 days ago. It's a bit unfair, but how do you describe yourself?
I'm going to steal what he said and genuinely say it depends on the day. I'm always my mother's daughter. I always describe myself as an architect. And I think it's really important that in all the spheres I work in, I claim myself as an architect first, in an effort to expand the way that we define architecture, in an effort to include all the other disciplines and the bodies of knowledge in the field of architecture. I'm a South African, I'm a woman, I'm a Muslim, I'm many, many other things.
Good. Well, we'll talk about hybrid identities in your practice and more broadly. But I think it's wonderful. I like a framework to play from, and I think an architect first and foremost is a good one. Now, there will be some imagery just as we talk, but of some of the work you've done. But I know there's a short film that it roots you. I think I've not seen it, so we're all new to this. But roots you in South Africa, in Johannesburg. So let's see a short film before we continue our conversation.
We need to ask ourselves if the world around us is being made in our image, and if it isn't, whose image is it being made of, and how do we start to make our own? When people are excluded or when stories are erased, it's a ravage of culture. A whole generation of thought that could have evolved out of that. My biggest inspiration is Joburg for all of its energy, all of its challenges, and all of its opportunities. The softness that there is in the quality of light, which I think is something really special about the city. I spent big amounts of my childhood in my grandfather's store in inner city Joburg, and I vividly remember walking the streets of Joburg as a child and really being in love with it from a very young age. It is a place of so many other places, movements, cultures, and different forces. People have found ways to make the city home. I think it's a testament to how resilient people are. When we were invited to make a submission for the pavilion, I really wanted to reflect what someone like me from our context and from our part of the world could bring to this pavilion. And I think that's something that Joburg has given me, or something that I strive for in my work, is always trying to read beneath the surface. And I really wanted to reflect a London that is plural and that is about many different places, that honors voices from many different times, past, present, and future. The role of an architect is to be able to absorb, reflect, and translate who we are into the world. We need to be able to listen deeply to these silences and whispers. There's a whole set of worlds that are waiting to happen inside of them. I often think about our identities and how different the world looks from different perspectives. Our architecture is slanted in a very particular worldview that is very limited. And so I think that understanding how our different ways of being manifest different differently visually, and then starting to explore what that can mean for architecture. My ambitions around building are very much about reimagining structures so that they reflect who we are, and we need to do that now.
One of the many reasons I wanted to talk to you publicly is because in what you do, there is, I think, a very original model in how we might try and approach architecture in different ways in the future. So without over-obsessing about the pavilion in London, but it was a kind of global gift or construction, I'd just like to unpick a bit of how you were able to, you said reimagine the future, but you actually produced a structure. It was collaborative. Just briefly, how did you begin to approach it? I mean, do you start with a blank sheet of paper and think, I want to build a structure, how will I do it? Or do you have an idea about how you're going to do it from the beginning, and the structure is the final manifestation of that?
So just maybe to re-identify myself. Before I identify as an architect, I always identify as a Joburger, which the film just reminded me. And that's something I think that I thought deeply about when we were approached to make a submission for the pavilion. I really thought, what does someone like me from Johannesburg have to say about London? My practice has always been rooted in working to translate the identity of my place, at that time Johannesburg, into design form, because I genuinely believe that there's so much inspiration all throughout the city, not only in terms of how we make form, but also in our methods for form making. So if we think about informal infrastructures and economies, if we think about ritual practices and so on, there's inspiration everywhere. And the pavilion is really a manifesto for form making. In my case, my form making is about reflecting place and reflecting Johannesburg. So I had to think, how does that translate to London? So of course, I wanted to translate London to London. And so I first started with a giant Wikipedia timeline of London. And I became particularly interested in the waves of migrations in London, which is something that's also synonymous with the condition of Johannesburg. It's always been linked with migration. It's linked to the idea of people coming there for a different or better future. It's linked to opportunities and being at the heart and the center of economy, which means that it's a place which is incredibly hybrid in its culture. Same for London, of course. And so I started to think about places that became important for people to construct home and construct belonging when they first came to London. Some of the first mosques, African churches, synagogues, but then also marketplaces that hold important ingredients for traditional recipes, or a cinema where someone could listen to something in their mother tongue, some of the first venues to play black music in London. And I looked at these places and worked to map them out. Many of them don't exist anymore. So it was also a kind of homage or honoring of the archive. And I also spent a lot of time in London. I moved to London once the commission was announced. And I spent time walking in present-day places like this that exist today, but that have not really been acknowledged. And the pavilion is an amalgamation of what I learned from these places. So I worked with the gestures of generosity, surfaces across which people gather, the way that a surface unfolds in the street for iftar or fast break around the time of the Grenfell protests, for example, or previously the ways in which people gathered on Brixton porch steps at the time of riots and protests. And I worked with these gestures of generosity and translated them into the forms that we had in the pavilion. So they became structures for people to gather. There was no furniture inside the pavilion, but these surfaces all became places that held gatherings. And then, most importantly to me, as much as it was about folding London into the pavilion, I also really wanted to fold the pavilion out into London. And we had collaborations with some of the partner institutions that really informed the research around the pavilion. And they took on a kind of diasporic logic, and that's what I mean about methods of practice evolving how we think about architecture. And so we had, for example, a stage set at the Albany, which is the first socialist theatre in the UK, which holds a small performance or a poetry recital. In terms of the everyday, it's also used for people to sit and have lunch. We had a structure at New Beacon Books also to hold listening sessions and for people to read and browse books. New Beacon Books is the first and largest collection of African and Afro-Caribbean literature in the UK. At the Tabernacle in Notting Hill, where I still am very lucky to have an ongoing relationship, we had a podium that was used as part of their performances and processions, and we just recently, post the Serpentine Pavilion, also launched a seating structure in collaboration with Alvaro Barrington there. Lastly, we launched a radio station in Barking and Dagenham at the Valence Library, which also listened to 10 years of civic work that the Serpentine has been doing. And it was really important for me when I took the commission on that I understood also how the infrastructure of the institution worked and where I could tap into it, where I could also work with deepening and listening to the knowledges that had already developed in the institution also.
That was a brilliant answer. And there's a lot to take in. And I think the notion of generosity, as well as I'm struck by the idea that you have to translate that research and that openness. But the idea it's something that is amalgamation, but also is emanation, is really powerful. The scale of the pavilion is, certainly the floor plan would just about fit in here and up. So, I mean, I was going to say, is it scalable? But you dealt with over 50 institutions, and that means restaurants and mosques, but partners, potentially. And London's quite a large city, it was across the city. But is there a blueprint or do you think it's possible in that practice to do a major institution, a museum, or town planning, placemaking? Is that, I'm not asking you whether you're planning global domination, but do you see this as scalable?
Absolutely, yes. I'm currently working on a project in Manchester in honor of the Pan-African Conference that happened there. That is also a development on the Pavilion project and on what we learned from working with incredible research institutions that I was lucky enough to work with. And part of the idea there is that will house and have relationships with places elsewhere. So we're extending the logic within the city, but then also broadly looking at other geographies that are important to these knowledge systems and where they come from. So absolutely, yes. I think it is a scalable idea on an urban scale, but also I think in terms of how knowledge is made and how we bring different partners into conversation. That's something that we really need to work on developing, and I hope I'm able to in the future.
I hope you are. This may be a very male question, and it has to be said the architecture profession is still very male. But where is your voice in all this? You have a very articulate voice. I thought I could discern it in the Serpentine Pavilion emphatically, but I wonder whether that interests you. In other words, if you're working so openly and so collaboratively with people, does it matter to you that there is a Sumayya Vally imprint in the end, that you have an architectural voice that is there in the structures that you create?
Well, thank you for that question. I think I don't want to put all this responsibility on myself, but when I make work, and part of what the Pavilion work to do is to listen deeply to and to honor voices of ancestors, to also honor the voices of all of the children that we, for example, collaborated with as part of the Listening to the City program as well. I think that by extension, we always bring other people with us. And especially, I think, if we do come from backgrounds that have been underrepresented in the past, so if one is a woman, a person of color, a Muslim, it means that we are looked to as a voice who represents many other voices. And that's, of course, positive in many aspects and difficult in many ways, because we also are just human and we also just are much more complex than a lot of these categories are made out to be. So I think by extension, we always bring other bodies of knowledge with us. And we also choose the bodies of knowledge that we respond to and we resonate with. And that's something that's very important. What kind of canon are we bringing into the world? But I also believe very much in the architect having agency. And I think that as much as we listen deeply to all our collaborators, as much as we acknowledge all of the voices that we work with and we listen to, it's still the responsibility of the architect to be able to take that and translate it into form. And often, I think, when we leave collaborations extremely open-ended, I think sometimes, maybe this is a bit controversial, that the architect is then shying away from the responsibility of having to translate that. So as much as I believe in all the other forms of architecture and as much as my practice touches on them, I also deeply believe in form making. And I believe in the responsibility of the architect to translate all of this collaboration into form.
When Al Weisman spoke yesterday, briefly but incredibly powerfully, about the notion that architecture is evidence, and that through exploring that evidence, we can and must hold individuals or governments to account. It emphasised very strongly the notion of architecture with political purpose, but that's obviously using existing architecture and the damage done and the memories that architecture carries as a means of doing that. Do you feel architecture has a specific political purpose or should speak truth to power, or is that more implicit in the structures and in the practice that you engage in?
I think architecture is extremely complicit in that it always is deeply political. It is, although it's such a tangible art form, it's also extremely abstract in that we recognize many other art forms as political. We can see that, we recognize it that way, we frame it that way also. Architecture, unfortunately, not so much. And I think we take for granted that we've all been born into architectures and we've all been born into forms. It's become so subconscious that we often don't question where these forms come from. And I'm South African, and I'm very much a Joburger, and Johannesburg has a deep history of segregation that still permeates and we still live with every day. Architecture was a huge part of the apartheid project. It affirmed our place in the world. It told us where we fit in the social hierarchy. And it's really marked all across our landscape, spatial planning and architecture. And if we can understand that architecture is such a profound force for segregation, then we can of course understand that it can also be a profound force for the opposite. And everything we've been talking about over the past few days, how we make spaces for culture, the importance of being able to see ourselves in our surroundings, and the importance of allowing that to evolve our senses of belonging. It's something that we're in dialogue with constantly, and that shapes our position and our place in the world. And that's why manifesting knowledges from different places is so incredibly important, because architecture is so much a part of our identity.
I think the idea that architecture's complicity in oppressive power structures is a point that may be obvious but really needs emphasising, and you're absolutely right. But I also really respond to the idea that you can seek the opposite. And I wonder whether, I mean, you mentioned it in the film, but you grew up in an Indian immigrant township near Johannesburg, or in Johannesburg, sorry. But you spoke about your grandfather's shop. Now, it's not a big leap to work out that might have been some kind of input into the way that you considered architecture, but whatever that shop did or was, and I'd like you to explain that a little, but I know it was a meeting place of sorts, is that something that you can actually use directly in informing your own practice, or is it, if not a subconscious, it's just one of a number of drives? I wonder how explicitly, though, one can create the meeting place shop, or whether it's something that just naturally comes organically, and it can't be designed by an architect.
No, I think it absolutely can be designed by an architect. Why not? understanding all of these ingredients and forces, because those, even my grandfather's store, that comes from particular forms of culture, ways of being, forms of generosity, hybridized with the fabric of Johannesburg and the built inherited city that we have, to then create different bodies of knowledge. And those bodies of knowledge have not yet, I think, been completely translated into architectural form, but they absolutely can. It's not so easy to see a one-to-one relation always, but what you described backstage about the way that the pavilion was fragmented and existed all over London, for me is a logic that comes from being diasporic. It's a method of practice that comes from being situated across many different places and being informed by many different influences. So I think it might not be one-to-one, but I definitely think that there's knowledge embedded in place, and working to be in dialogue with place constantly and thinking about how we can learn from that is incredibly important. The shop itself, it's very, very different now. It still exists. But from what I remember back then, it was rows and rows and rows of textiles from the Basotho region in Lesotho and from all over the world, from Turkey. But what I remember most was that the front was completely open and that I would walk from there all the way to the Johannesburg Library, where I was completely immersed in fiction. Along the way, I think there were many, many things that I remember very vividly. Trade stalls, somebody having a pop-up kitchen where they would serve samosas, on and on and on, just seeing people really live out their rituals in the city on top of and above systems in which they'd been excluded. And of course, I didn't understand that at the time. Coupled with the incredible optimism of growing up in the time of the Rainbow Nation in South Africa, where everything felt completely possible and there was an atmosphere of change. I think that was incredibly formative.
See, that's again such a potent description, because one of the things that keeps emerging from this conference in sessions with architects is the need or desire to try and produce a more sensory architecture. So in your descriptions, I can hear Johannesburg and I can smell the samosa store and the embodiment of you moving from one place to another. But that's not consciously designed by an architect. That's done through community usage, or people saying, I'm going to beat this oppression, or I'm going to work with it. So how can an architect either recreate that or give people the opportunity to have that kind of urban experience?
Well, those are forms of placemaking, and they are ways that people made place before those knowledges were ravaged or stopped by forces of colonization or imposed forms of city making that didn't listen deeply to those knowledges. So there was a time, perhaps, where cities were made and cities were designed with those systems of placemaking. There came a time then where there was projected knowledge onto place that didn't necessarily listen to those things. But we all have those kind of primordial instincts that we refer back to and that we draw on and we call on when we make place. So if anything, I think those sensory descriptions are examples of how resilient people have been, that their lived experiences, their embodied knowledges are able to transcend limitations and are able to transcend harsh urban environments. But architects still need to be able to listen deeply to those and work through how we can work with them to evolve our cities to being much more, I don't want to say representative, I want to use a word that is more akin to manifestation, but that manifests those ways of being and works to evolve them. Sorry, I'm repeating myself, but I think there is...
No, that's not, actually. The nuanced differences there. And I think the notion of... cultural archaeology as well as literal archaeology to look back to how cities were. I mean, not just recently, but it could also be, atavistically, is important. And that's how we make a new future. And I think, again, it's another theme that keeps emerging from this conference, that it's not just the sort of, the bright utopian vision of the future, and you only have to look into the eyes of a humanoid robot to know that it's not a bright future, it's a complex one and slightly frightening, but there's opportunities. I'm curious as to which architects you have most admired, or who has been the most influence on you within the architectural practice?
So many. I've always been deeply inspired by architects who have channeled their complex hybrid identities into their way of practice. So I'm really inspired by Noguchi. I've been incredibly inspired by Zaha Hadid. I'm really inspired by Sir David Ajay. I'm inspired by Balkrishna Doshi. All of those architects have very different ways of form making. But for me, all of them have manifested worldviews in form that are completely different to what came before them.
I discovered, just speaking to you backstage, that both of us had the as I say, privilege, but the treat of seeing David Ajay's building, the Abrahamic house here. And I know he and Chris Durkin are going to talk about that later, so we won't go into too much detail. But that did strike me as I was walking around, that this would somehow resonate with you in certain ways, that there are three nominally identical buildings, but inside of which each reflects world religion, the three great world religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. And that's the result of deep research. There's also creative and architectural interpretation there, and generosity. But there's hybrid, it's not hybridity, is it? It's emphatic difference, but linked through the architectural structure. That's dealing with the very sensitive but important issue of religion. This is a clunky segue, but you can pick up back if you want. How are you going to approach the first Islamic Biennale? Because, there's a model there, isn't there, about, well, let's focus on a particular area, a particular religion, rather, that has generated a certain art. But people like me always cross-refer. I can't look at Islamic art without looking at Western art, which is fundamentally Christian and so on. How will you approach that Biennale?
You're absolutely right. I think that when the hybridity doesn't always mean that everything is flattened out. I think it is about being able to pick up and draw on cultural specificities, but also to celebrate the resonances across place that we find and we have across geography, across religion, across different ways of being and different bodies of knowledge. I really do believe that at the heart of it, all of us have the same primordial and ancestral instincts in how we do things and the ways in which we respond to the world. For the Biennale, I really wanted to work with and think through what Islamic art means and can mean for this moment now and for the future. And so alongside traditional, historic, significant objects and archaeological finds, we have contemporary commissions that reflect on what Islamic art can be in this moment. The theme for the Biennale is called Awwal Bayt, which means first house, and that reflects on the site of the Biennale first and foremost. So the Biennale is sited in Jeddah, in the Hajj terminal airport, which is the gateway for pilgrims, and which for me, when I visited that site, I was flooded with memories of being there as a pilgrim and seeing the entire world come and gather underneath this incredible canopy. Seeing people from around the world, foods from around the world, hearing accents from everywhere, also knowing that everyone is united in this purpose of undertaking the pilgrimage. And so Awwal Bayt, in two parts, on the one hand, reflects on the universality of spiritual practice in Islam and the ways in which we always refer to the holy sites and most specifically the Kaaba in Mecca. So the ways that our rituals are organized around the rhythms of the day, around the seasons, around the natural elements, the moment of orientation when we stand up in prayer, we all face the Kaaba. Beyond that, I think spiritual things that all of us can relate to in terms of vibrational energy, in terms of, as I said, how we relate to the sun and the moon and the movement of celestial bodies. So on the one hand, it thinks through forms of spiritual practice and the construction of belonging, the construction of first house in relation to spirituality. What are the things that we return to and how we construct spiritual belonging? But then it also reflects on how the source has moved and traveled to the entire world. So this is a place that has fostered so much gathering, so much cultural connection, and that really has been a catalyst in bringing people together and in being a platform for people to share knowledge because of the pilgrimage, but also before that, I think if we think about Mesopotamia, it's really a place that the entire world has moved through. So when we move outside underneath this canopy structure, we're going to experience works that really reflect on that. What are the forms of cultural belonging that we return to that relate to our Islamic faith as first principles of belonging? So there we're thinking about food, we're thinking about sound, forms of generosity and hospitality that really come from our faith. And I hope it's going to be different to what is in the current imagination when people describe works of Islamic art. I hope that it's going to be able to build on that definition of Islamic art and present something that I hope is really resonant with our lived practices, our lived experiences, and draws on bodies of knowledge that come from places of difference all around the world. I think it's a really important title also to call something an Islamic Art Biennale. It's important that we take this on and we work with it and we believe deeply and we also acknowledge that Islamic tradition, Islamic faith, Islamic practice can and should be making a creative contribution to the world.
Frank Gehry made a very clear and eloquent point yesterday about the obvious interconnection between art and architecture, and that he felt both processes were essential to him. Sometimes some of my best friends in the curatorial world can get a little territorial. I think just hearing you now ought to reassure people and in fact inspire people to understand that asking someone who fundamentally identifies as an architect to be a curator of an art biennale is something that we should do more of. There is an obvious symbiosis too between how you describe what you're going to do in the first Islamic Biennale and your practice as an artist. So thank you. And let's also bring to the fore how inspiring it is to meet yet another Johannesburger who's so eloquent and thoughtful. Sumayya's on the Time 100 Next list. Trevor is on the Time 100 list now. South Africa's coming, clearly. Sumayya Vally, thank you very much. Thank you.